In the summer heat of 1943, 5 young Americans stood before a machine that would soon decide their fate, the M4 Sherman tank. To the untrained eye, it looked invincible: 30 tons of armor, steel treads gripping the earth, and a 75mm gun pointed toward destiny. But to those who would live inside it, the Sherman wasn't just a weapon. It was a world, a steel beast that demanded everything from its crew. They came from different corners of America. The gunner, Private Joe Haskins, had once fixed tractors in Kansas. The loader, Eddie Morales, was a mechanic from Brooklyn. Their commander, Lieutenant Ray Dawson, was barely 24, but carried the weight of men twice his age. Alongside them, Corporal Tommy Graves manned the driver's seat, and radio operator Bill Turner handled communication, the crew's voice to the outside world. When they first climbed into their tank at Fort Knox, the air inside was suffocating. Oil fumes mixed with the smell of paint and hot metal. The space was tighter than they'd imagined. No room to stretch, barely space to breathe. The training sergeant barked, "This will be your home, your coffin, and your best friend. Learn her or she'll kill you." Days turned into weeks of relentless drills. They practiced loading shells until their fingers bled. They drove through mud, sand, and rain, learning every groan and rattle of their steel companion. The Sherman roared across fields, its engine echoing like thunder, a sound they'd soon associate with both safety and death. At night, the men sat beside their tank, cleaning weapons and eating cold rations under the stars. They joked about home, about the girls they'd left behind, about how the Krauts won't know what hit them. Yet behind every laugh was the quiet understanding that not all of them might make it back. By autumn, their orders arrived: Europe. Their training was over. The real war waited across the Atlantic. As their transport ship carried them toward destiny, Dawson looked back at the fading coastline of America and whispered, "Next stop, hell." The Sherman crew's journey had begun. Inside that steel shell, they would eat, sleep, fight, and bleed together. When the Sherman first rolled off the landing craft and onto the beaches of France, the 5-man crew learned just what it meant to live inside the iron cage. From the outside, it looked like a juggernaut. Inside, it was a sweltering, rattling oven of steel, where every inch of space was claimed by man or machine. The commander sat in a narrow turret ring, half his body exposed when the hatch was open, his periscope sweeping the horizon. Below him, the gunner's seat was wedged between ammunition racks that lined the hull, shells stacked like silent promises of destruction. The loader had barely enough room to twist and grab a shell, his knees constantly bruised against steel. The driver crouched low in the front, eyes fixed on the road through 2 tiny viewing slits, while beside him, the assistant driver, who also doubled as the bow gunner, kept one hand on the machine gun, the other ready to help shift gears when the transmission jammed. The air inside was thick with oil fumes and the smell of burnt cordite. Every sound, from the grinding gears to the clank of treads, echoed in their bones. Talking required shouting, even inches apart. When the engine roared to life, conversation was replaced by instinct, a tap on the shoulder, a hand signal, or the vibration of the tank itself. The air inside was thick with oil fumes and the smell of burnt cordite. Every sound, from the grinding gears to the clank of treads, echoed in their bones. Talking required shouting, even inches apart. When the engine roared to life, conversation was replaced by instinct, a tap on the shoulder, a hand signal, or the vibration of the tank itself. The crew's world was reduced to steel walls, red-hot shells, and sweat. Days blurred together as they rumbled through French countryside, dodging artillery and snipers. Outside, war was chaos. Inside, it was a machine rhythm: fire, reload, drive, repeat. They learned to function like a single organism. If one man faltered, the rest paid the price. Every role was critical: the gunner's aim, the loader's timing, the driver's reflexes. Trust wasn't optional, it was survival. Sometimes they cracked open the hatch just to gulp fresh air, but even that carried risk. A sniper's bullet could end it all. So they stayed sealed inside, sweating, swearing, and fighting in a world of noise and darkness. Inside that iron cage, they weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a crew, a family forged by fire, welded together by fear and duty. And as the rumble of war grew louder, they knew this was only the beginning. By the time the Sherman crew reached the outskirts of Normandy, the men had learned that hunger didn't wait for the battlefield to quiet down. Inside their 30-ton home, food wasn't about comfort. It was survival in its simplest, grittiest form. There was no kitchen, no table, no place to sit and eat in peace. Meals were crammed between missions, between shell reloads and maintenance checks. The army called them sea rations, tin cans packed with processed meat, beans, hash, and coffee powder. They were heavy, greasy, and often cold. When the crew was lucky enough to stop for an hour, they'd light a small sterno stove outside the tank or use a hot engine block to warm their rations. The loader, Eddie Morales, became the unofficial cook. He'd line up the cans on a rag near the transmission, letting the heat do its work. The smell of beans mixed with diesel filled the tank, a strange reminder that even in war, men had to eat. Sometimes they shared chocolate bars or instant coffee packets sent from home. Those small comforts, a sip of lukewarm coffee, a single cigarette, meant everything. But there were rules. Never open food near ammunition. Never throw cans outside where the enemy could track your position. And never, ever waste time during combat hours. A full meal was a luxury. Most days they ate with one hand and loaded shells with the other. When rations ran low, desperation took over. They traded cigarettes with infantry for bread, scavenged from abandoned farmhouses, or accepted whatever supplies were dropped by passing convoys. Food became currency, but more than that, it was morale. At night, after hours of firing and maneuvering, the crew might share one can of beans between them. The commander would pass it around, each man taking a spoonful, joking about how it tasted like home. The truth was, it didn't, but it reminded them why they were there, to live long enough to taste a real meal again. In the belly of the Sherman, food wasn't just sustenance, it was a ritual, a fragile connection to the world beyond the armor plates. Between the thunder of guns and the silence that followed, the clink of a spoon on metal was sometimes the only sound of humanity left. After weeks on the road, the Sherman tank stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like a home made of steel and noise. Not a comfortable one, but the only one they had. The men lived inside it through rain, mud, and mortar fire. It was their shield, their shelter, and sometimes their prison. Inside, there was no real room to stretch, no bed to lie on, no comfort beyond what you could carve out of metal corners. When the day's fighting ended and the engines cooled, the men made do. The driver and assistant driver slept where they sat, their helmets tilted over their eyes. The gunner and loader curled up on the turret floor, leaning against cold shells stacked like walls around them. The commander, up top, would wedge himself half in, half out of the hatch, keeping one eye on the stars, the other on the horizon. The sounds of the tank never truly stopped. Even in rest, it creaked, clicked, and groaned as if alive. The men learned to sleep through anything: distant artillery, gunfire, even the rumble of nearby tanks. Sleep wasn't measured in hours, only in minutes between alarms. They washed with canteens or, when lucky, with rainwater collected off the hull. Clothes were rarely changed. The smell of fuel, sweat, and gunpowder clung to everything. Letters from home became treasures, read under the dim glow of a flashlight, tucked into breast pockets for luck. In those quiet hours, the tank wasn't just a weapon, it was a cocoon. Inside it, the outside world couldn't touch them. The walls that trapped them also kept death at bay. They laughed, argued, and shared stories about home, about baseball, about what they'd do when the war was over. The laughter echoed off steel walls, rough and human against the cold metal. And when dawn came, the home became a weapon again. The same floor they slept on became the deck they'd fight from. The same walls that kept them warm now shook from explosions. Life inside a tank blurred the line between man and machine. They didn't just operate the Sherman, they lived it, breathed it, and carried its scars. The tank became their fortress, their family, and their fate. Dawn broke over northern France in a haze of fog and smoke. The air smelled of diesel and damp earth. Lieutenant Dawson's crew sat silently inside their Sherman, waiting for the order to move. The radio crackled, then came the command, "Advance." The engine roared to life, gears grinding as the 30-ton tank lurched forward. They were part of a long column pushing toward a small village held by German forces. Nobody spoke. Every man knew that once they crossed the next ridge, they'd be within range of German anti-tank guns, the dreaded 88s that could rip through a Sherman like paper. "Eyes open," Dawson said, his voice calm but tight. The gunner, Haskins, peered through his scope, hands trembling slightly on the elevation wheel. Morales, the loader, crouched beside the ammunition rack, ready to slam a shell into the breach. Then the first shell hit. It wasn't theirs. The explosion rocked the ground ahead, a column of smoke rising from the lead tank. "We've got contact," Dawson shouted. The air filled with thunder as both sides opened fire. Inside the Sherman, chaos became routine. Haskins shouted, "Target front, 300 yards." Morales rammed a shell home, clang, and Haskins fired. The entire tank jolted backward, the recoil echoing through their bones. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. "Hit!" Dawson yelled as they saw a German half-track burst into flames. But victory lasted seconds. A return shell slammed nearby, pelting the Sherman with dirt and shrapnel. The loader ducked, the radio hissed, and Graves, the driver, gritted his teeth, pushing the tank forward through the mud. Sweat poured down their faces despite the cold air. Every shot was a gamble, every movement a risk. The Germans were dug in, camouflaged, waiting for the Shermans to expose themselves. When their tank finally rolled into the village, smoke and rubble swallowed the streets. The men could barely see. They fired through windows, at rooftops, anywhere the muzzle flashes appeared. After what felt like hours, the gunfire stopped. Silence returned, broken only by the tick of cooling metal. Morales leaned back, hands shaking, soot streaking his face. "We made it," he muttered. Dawson looked out through the cracked periscope. 4 tanks in their platoon had started the attack. Only 2 still stood. The war had just become real, and there was no turning back. The battle might have ended that day, but for Dawson's crew, the war never paused. Their Sherman limped away from the smoking village, scarred, dented, and coughing black exhaust. A shell fragment had torn through the rear armor, shattering part of the engine housing. The tank could still move, but barely. They pulled off the road into a hedgerow, hidden from enemy view. The smell of burnt oil hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and sweat. Dawson climbed out first, scanning the horizon. The enemy was out there somewhere, unseen but always listening. "All right, boys," he said, "let's get her breathing again." Tank repairs in the field weren't about skill, they were about desperation. Morales and Turner pried open the engine deck while Graves crawled underneath, cursing at every turn. Tools were scarce and spare parts were luxury. They made do with whatever they could scavenge: wires from a wrecked tank, bolts hammered flat with a wrench, even cloth torn from their uniforms to patch leaks. Every clang of metal echoed through the still air. Each sound risked drawing attention, but stopping wasn't an option. The Sherman wasn't just their transport, it was their life. If it died here, so did they. "Oil lines busted," Graves muttered, face streaked with grease. "She'll cook herself if we don't patch it." "Then patch it," Dawson snapped, keeping one eye on the tree line. He wasn't angry, just afraid. They all were. Hours dragged by. They worked in silence, covered in grime and fear. Occasionally, artillery boomed in the distance, a reminder that the front was never far. When they finally got the engine to sputter back to life, the crew let out a breath none of them realized they'd been holding. That night, they sat beside the Sherman, eating cold beans from a can, too exhausted to talk. The stars above seemed impossibly distant. Morales wiped his hands on a rag and muttered, "You know, she's tougher than all of us." Dawson looked at the tank, its armor scarred but standing. "She has to be," he said softly. Out here, surrounded by death, the Sherman wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a living, breathing guardian. And every time they brought her back from the edge, it reminded them that they were still alive too. By the autumn of 1944, the crew of Dawson's Sherman had become more than just soldiers. They were brothers, welded together by fire, fear, and fate. Inside the cramped walls of their tank, friendship wasn't a choice, it was a lifeline. Days on the front were measured not in hours, but in how long they could go without losing someone they knew. The men slept beside one another, ate from the same rations, and fought shoulder to shoulder in the same machine that had saved them more times than they could count. Outside, France burned, villages reduced to rubble, forests scarred by shell fire. But inside the Sherman, they found a strange kind of peace, a rhythm of survival that only they understood. Each man had a role, and each depended entirely on the others. The gunner couldn't fire without the loader's timing. The driver couldn't move without the commander's orders. Even the smallest mistake, 1 second of hesitation, could mean death for them all. At night, they talked about home. Morales would tell stories about Brooklyn, where the streets smelled of bread and gasoline instead of blood and mud. Haskins would talk about his father's farm in Kansas, where the loudest thing you'd hear was the hum of cicadas. Turner, the quiet one, would just listen, staring at the stars through the hatch, whispering names none of them ever asked about. There were jokes, too. Inside that dark armored shell, laughter was their rebellion. Morales once painted a pinup girl on the side of the tank and named her Lucky Lady. Because, he grinned, she's gotta keep us lucky somehow. They fought for each other more than for orders. When one tank in their platoon went down, they didn't hesitate. They charged forward, smoke and bullets be damned. "We don't leave our own," Dawson said once, voice steady even as shells fell around them. And they didn't. Brotherhood inside a tank was born from shared danger. You didn't have to like everyone, you just had to trust them with your life. And by now, every man in that Sherman knew trust was all they had left. In the war's endless roar, it was that bond, not medals, not orders, that kept them fighting, day after brutal day. By winter of 1944, the war had turned into a grind of mud, metal, and misery. The Sherman was no longer just a weapon, it was a coffin that rumbled forward through Europe, one battlefield at a time. The crew had survived for months now, but the price was showing on their faces. Hollow eyes, cracked hands, and silence where laughter used to be. The smell inside the tank told the story of war better than any report could. Oil, sweat, gunpowder, and smoke clung to everything. It seeped into their uniforms, their skin, even their dreams. When the engine ran hot, it felt like breathing inside a furnace. When it stopped, the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of cooling steel. They lived in filth. There was no time to clean, no way to escape the grime. Their boots were caked with mud from 3 different countries. Rats scurried through supply crates. Food tasted of metal and gasoline. But it wasn't the dirt that wore them down. It was the waiting. Long stretches of nothing, punctuated by moments of terror. The crew would sit inside the Sherman for hours, listening to distant artillery, never knowing if the next shell would land on them. The fear became routine. Morales once said, "You stop being scared when you realize it doesn't help." Yet at night, when the world went quiet, they all dreamed of home. of clean sheets, warm food, and silence that didn't mean danger. Outside, the landscape was unrecognizable. Trees shattered by gunfire, frozen fields dotted with abandoned tanks, steel carcasses half buried in snow. The smell of burning fuel and death hung over everything, so thick it became normal. Dawson kept his men moving, even when they were exhausted. "We stay sharp, we stay alive," he'd remind them. It wasn't courage that kept them going, it was duty, and the unspoken promise they'd made to one another, to get home together or not at all. In the quiet moments between battles, when snow fell softly on their tanks' battered armor, they'd look at each other and know they'd already left pieces of themselves behind. The smell of war wasn't just on their clothes, it was inside them now, burned into memory, impossible to wash away. By February 1945, victory felt close, close enough to taste, but still far enough to die for. The Americans were pushing through the Siegfried Line, and Dawson's Sherman led the charge. The crew had become a machine. Every motion was instinct now. Load, aim, fire, move. The tank lurched forward through the mud, its engine growling like a wounded animal. German shells screamed overhead, tearing holes in the gray sky. Inside the Sherman, chaos was precision. Morales slammed shells into the breach, sweat running down his face despite the cold. "Ready!" he shouted. King aimed, breathing steady. Dawson gave the order, "Fire!" The cannon thundered, and another enemy bunker vanished in a cloud of dirt and flame. They advanced street by street, crushing resistance, pushing deeper into Germany. Civilians hid in basements, their faces pale with fear and confusion. To the tank crew, they were ghosts drifting through a war too big for anyone to control. Then came the moment they'd all remember forever. A German Panzer IV appeared at the end of a narrow road, its barrel already aimed. Dawson shouted, "Turn, turn!" but it was too late. The Panzer fired. The shell hit the Sherman's side, tearing through armor like paper. The inside erupted in sparks and flame. Morales went down first, thrown against the wall by the blast. King tried to pull him up, coughing, blinded by the fire. Dawson's voice cut through the chaos. "Get out! Move!" They dragged Morales out through the hatch, flames licking at their backs. The crew tumbled into the snow as the Sherman burned behind them, their home, their protection, gone in seconds. Medics arrived too late. Morales was still, his eyes open, but seeing nothing. The man who had made them laugh in the darkest hours was gone. For the first time, Dawson didn't speak. He just stared at the wreck, his hands trembling, the flames reflecting in his eyes. They'd won the battle, the Panzer destroyed by another American tank, but the victory felt hollow. The cost was too real. That night, as they sat in silence under the stars, the snow still falling gently on the smoldering remains of their Sherman, Dawson finally whispered, "He made it this far. That's more than most can say." The others nodded. No cheers. No celebration. Just the quiet truth of war, that triumph always comes hand in hand with tragedy. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world seemed to exhale. For Captain Dawson and the few who survived from his tank crew, the silence was deafening. No more engines, no more shells, no more shouting orders, just the hollow echo of memory. They boarded a ship home, their uniforms still stained with oil and ash, their eyes older than their years. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before them, gray and cold, like the war's last unspoken secret. As the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon, some men cheered. Others cried. Dawson just stood there quietly, cap in hand, thinking of Morales. He could almost hear his laughter in the ocean breeze, that same laugh that used to cut through fear like sunlight through fog. Back home, everything looked the same. the streets, the stores, the fields, untouched by the horror that had swallowed half the world. But to Dawson, it all felt different. The noise of traffic made him flinch. The smell of gasoline reminded him of burning steel. Even the laughter of children carried a strange ache. He visited Morales's family first. His mother opened the door before Dawson could even speak. She knew. No words were needed. She invited him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, silent, the same table Morales had grown up around. Dawson placed Morales's dog tags on the table. His hands shook. He was brave, was all he could manage. Later, at a local diner, Dawson met up with King and 2 other crewmen who had made it back. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about fishing, about baseball, about plans that felt foreign now. But between the laughter were long pauses, each man lost in the same invisible battlefield in his mind. Years later, Dawson would drive by a local parade on Veterans Day. Children waved flags, people clapped for the old soldiers, and for a moment he smiled. Not because of pride, but because he knew what it had taken. He looked up at the sky, remembering the sound of roaring engines and the faces that never came home. In that quiet moment, he whispered, "We brought them home, Morales. We made it." The breeze carried his words away, lost in the same sky where freedom had once hung by a thread, and where brave men, locked inside steel beasts, had fought not for glory, but for each other.